The South Pacific covers a space so large that distance becomes difficult to measure in ordinary terms. Water occupies nearly every direction. Small islands appear rarely, separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. Some are volcanic points rising from deep water. Others are coral formations resting only a few feet above sea level. Many remained unknown to European navigation for long periods of history. Pitcairn Island stands among them. It lies in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, isolated from major land routes and distant from larger island groups. The island itself is small, formed by volcanic activity, with steep cliffs rising directly from the sea. Dense vegetation once covered much of its interior. Waves moved constantly against dark rock at the shoreline. Landing on the island was difficult in poor conditions, and approaching ships had few safe points of access. In the late 18th century, the Pacific remained incomplete on European maps. Navigation had improved, but large portions of the ocean still carried uncertainty. Positions could be estimated incorrectly. Islands could be misplaced by many miles. Some locations existed on charts but not precisely where sailors expected them to be. Before permanent settlement, Pitcairn existed apart from regular movement and trade. Seasons passed with little interruption. Wind crossed the slopes. Rain moved across the ridges and valleys. Birds nested among trees and cliffs. For long periods, there was no sign that anyone was expected to arrive. In December 1787, a small British naval vessel departed from England under orders from the British government. The ship was HMS Bounty. Its assignment was practical and economic. The vessel had been sent across the world to collect breadfruit plants from the South Pacific and transport them to the Caribbean, where colonial authorities hoped the crop could become a low-cost food source for enslaved laborers. The ship itself was not large. HMS Bounty measured less than 100 feet in length and carried a relatively small crew. Command belonged to Lieutenant William Bligh. Although commonly remembered as Captain Bligh, his formal naval rank during the voyage remained lieutenant. The journey westward was long. Months at sea created routines that repeated with little change. Crews during that period lived in confined conditions. Food was limited by what could be preserved. Fresh water had to be controlled carefully. Space, privacy, and comfort were minimal. After reaching the Pacific, the expedition arrived at Tahiti in 1788. There the crew remained for approximately 5 months while breadfruit plants were collected and prepared for transport. The stay was far longer than originally planned. Tahiti offered conditions very different from life aboard a naval vessel. Food was available in greater quantity. Daily life moved differently. Some crew members formed relationships with local people and adapted quickly to the environment around them. When HMS Bounty departed Tahiti in April 1789, the transition back to naval discipline created strain among parts of the crew. Historical records describe growing divisions. Accounts differ regarding individual motives and responsibilities, and later interpretations often reflected personal loyalties. On April 28, 1789, approximately 3 weeks after leaving Tahiti, a group led by Fletcher Christian took control of the ship. William Bligh and 18 loyal crew members were forced into a small open launch and set adrift. The event became known as the Mutiny on the Bounty. For some of the men who remained aboard the ship, the separation from British authority had already begun. After the mutiny, HMS Bounty no longer followed an official route. The original mission had ended. The men aboard were now moving without authorization and without a clear future destination. Fletcher Christian and the others understood the position they occupied. Mutiny against the Royal Navy carried severe consequences. If captured and returned to Britain, punishment would almost certainly follow. The event itself had transformed the ship into evidence. Any recognized port, any known settlement, and any passing vessel created risk. In the months after the mutiny, the group moved across parts of the Pacific. Some men remained in Tahiti. Others left again aboard the Bounty. Those who continued included 9 mutineers, several Polynesian men, and Polynesian women and children who joined the settlement effort. The search that followed was not simply for land. Islands existed throughout the Pacific, but many were known locations. A visible settlement connected to trade routes or exploration could eventually bring contact with British ships. They required something different. Maps in the late 18th century still contained uncertainty. Navigators calculated longitude with improving accuracy, but errors remained common. Entire islands occasionally appeared in the wrong location. Small mistakes on charts could create large gaps between expectation and reality. Pitcairn Island had been recorded decades earlier by European explorers, but its position on British charts was inaccurate. The island existed, but it did not exist exactly where maps suggested it should be. For men attempting to disappear, this created an unusual possibility. A place hidden not because it could not be seen, but because anyone searching for it might be looking in the wrong part of the ocean. Toward the beginning of 1790, HMS Bounty moved toward that possibility. In January 1790, HMS Bounty reached Pitcairn Island. The approach was not simple. Steep cliffs rose from the sea, and rough coastal conditions limited where boats could land. The island offered few easy entrances. From the water, much of the shoreline appeared closed. For the people aboard the ship, however, the island represented something more important than comfort. It represented distance. Historical records suggest that the group spent time examining the island before making a final decision. Fresh water was present. Vegetation was abundant. The land appeared capable of supporting crops. More importantly, the island sat far from established routes and remained incorrectly positioned on contemporary charts. The location matched the requirement that had guided months of movement across the Pacific. The group landed supplies and animals. Tools came ashore. Seeds and useful materials followed. Everything that could support long-term life had to be removed from the ship. Their future depended on what could be carried onto land during those early movements between coast and settlement site. Then they made a decision that permanently altered the situation. After unloading the ship, HMS Bounty was set on fire. Accounts from later years indicate that the vessel burned in the waters near the island after its supplies had been removed. Some portions of the wreck later remained visible beneath the water. The exact sequence of decisions surrounding the burning has been discussed by historians, but the purpose itself appears clear. The ship connected them to another life. It also connected them to pursuit. Once the fire spread through the vessel, there was no practical return. Smoke rose above the island and disappeared into open air. Wood, rope, sails, and structure were gradually reduced by flame. The ship that had crossed oceans ceased to exist. From that point forward, Pitcairn Island was no longer a place of arrival. It had become the place where they lived. The first weeks on Pitcairn Island were occupied by practical work. Survival did not begin with dramatic events. It began with ordinary tasks repeated each day. Shelter had to be built. Water had to be collected and stored. Land had to be understood before it could be used. The island itself offered advantages and limitations at the same time. Freshwater streams crossed sections of the landscape. Trees provided material for construction and fuel. The climate allowed crops to grow. But the terrain was uneven. Steep slopes divided movement across parts of the island, and dense vegetation covered large areas that first had to be cleared. The settlement included different groups with different backgrounds. The British mutineers came from naval life. Most had experience with ships and physical labor, but few had experience creating an isolated agricultural community from the beginning. The Polynesian men and women who arrived with them brought knowledge that became equally important. Survival on remote islands required familiarity with local conditions, food sources, and methods of adaptation that European sailors often lacked. The settlement slowly took shape through combined effort. Land was cleared for cultivation. Trees were cut and used as building material. Structures appeared gradually rather than all at once. There was no existing village waiting for occupation. Every shelter, storage area, and cultivated field had to be created by hand. Animals brought from the Bounty also became important resources. Historical accounts describe pigs, goats, chickens, and other supplies transferred from the ship before its destruction. These represented a form of security for the future. Food sources that could reproduce reduced dependence on uncertain gathering or fishing alone. Routine developed because routine was necessary. Morning labor became separated from evening labor. Physical work occupied much of the day. Water had to be moved. Crops had to be planted and maintained. Repairs required constant attention. Small communities in isolated environments often depend upon repeated maintenance rather than occasional effort. At first, the settlement remained relatively small and manageable. The island provided resources, and immediate shortages did not define daily life. But long-term isolation creates different pressures than short-term survival. At sea, men had lived within systems established by naval structure and command. On Pitcairn Island, those systems no longer existed. The authority of ships, ranks, and official rules had disappeared with HMS Bounty. A community had replaced a crew. And communities depend on arrangements that must continue long after the first shelters are finished. After the first shelters and cultivated areas had been established, survival on Pitcairn Island became increasingly tied to repetition. The work changed slowly over time, but the need for work did not disappear. Life on the island moved according to practical requirements rather than fixed schedules. Agriculture became one of the central activities. Historical accounts describe crops such as yams, bananas, taro, and sweet potatoes being cultivated on the island. Some plants had arrived with the settlers. Others already existed in the Pacific environment and could be maintained through established Polynesian practices. Farming on isolated land involved uncertainty. Weather conditions shifted. Soil quality differed across the island. A successful planting season could not be assumed simply because land existed. Fields had to be monitored and maintained over long periods. Fishing added another source of food. The surrounding ocean contained fish in considerable numbers, but access remained dependent on conditions. Pitcairn's shoreline was not uniformly easy to approach. Rough seas and rocky coastal areas complicated movement. Animals introduced from the Bounty gradually became part of daily life as well. Pigs and chickens represented more than food alone. They reduced pressure on other resources and offered a degree of continuity for the settlement. The island itself provided materials that repeatedly entered everyday activity. Wood became fuel and construction material. Plants served practical purposes beyond consumption. Small communities often survive through the repeated use of ordinary resources rather than rare discoveries. Days gradually became less defined by major events. Work occupied mornings and afternoons. Repairs followed weather damage. Fields required attention after rain or periods of dry conditions. Tasks returned in cycles. The same locations were crossed repeatedly. The same paths connected shelters and cultivated land. For people living in isolation, routine often becomes a form of structure that replaces larger systems outside the community. Months passed. Ships did not appear on the horizon. No messages arrived from outside the island. No news reached the settlement regarding Britain, Tahiti, or the world beyond the Pacific. Time continued to move, but movement itself had narrowed. The ocean surrounding Pitcairn was not changing. The people living within it were. As the months became years, Pitcairn Island moved further away from the world that had originally sent the Bounty across the Pacific. Not in distance, but in experience. The settlement no longer resembled a temporary refuge. Temporary places are organized around departure. Pitcairn increasingly reflected permanence. Children were born on the island. Daily life adjusted around their presence. A new generation began to exist without direct memory of naval life, Britain, or the voyage that had brought the settlement into existence. For them, the island was not an endpoint after a long journey. It was the beginning of ordinary life. Time on isolated settlements often becomes difficult to measure in the same way as life within larger societies. Calendars can continue, but social markers change. News does not arrive. Political events occur elsewhere without immediate effect. Seasons become more noticeable than dates. Historical records from later visitors suggest that structures of order gradually developed within the settlement, although these systems changed over time and were not always stable. Labor had to be divided. Resources had to be shared. Disagreements required responses. Small communities create dependence among their members. Distance limits alternatives. On larger land masses, individuals can leave conflicts and move elsewhere. On Pitcairn Island, options remained restricted. The island itself reinforced those limits. Steep terrain separated some parts of the settlement. Thick vegetation and uneven ground slowed movement. Beyond the coastline, there was only open ocean extending for great distances in every direction. Contact with the outside world did not occur. No passing vessel arrived to establish regular trade. No official expedition appeared to investigate the island. The inaccurate charts that had helped the settlers disappear continued to serve their purpose. Years passed under those conditions. The people who had arrived from different backgrounds gradually shared the same environment, the same labor, and the same limitations. But isolation does not only remove outside pressures. Over time, it can concentrate pressures that already exist inside a community. The island had provided land, water, and distance. It had not removed human conflict. The early years on Pitcairn Island are often remembered through the idea of successful escape and settlement. But historical records describing life there also contain violence, instability, and loss. The community had been built from individuals who came from different cultures and different positions within the settlement itself. The British mutineers held much of the authority during the earliest period. The Polynesian men and women who had arrived with them did not occupy equal positions within that structure. Over time, tensions developed. Accounts written later by survivors and visitors describe disagreements surrounding labor, relationships, and unequal treatment. Exact details vary between sources, and some records were created years after the events themselves. Certain sequences remain uncertain. But the broader pattern appears consistently in historical descriptions. The isolation that protected the settlement also prevented escape from conflict. On larger land masses, disputes sometimes disperse as people move apart. Pitcairn offered little space for separation. The population remained small. Everyone depended on the same resources and occupied the same limited environment. By the early 1790s, violence began to emerge within the community. Several Polynesian men were killed during conflicts with the mutineers. Retaliatory violence followed. Additional deaths occurred over the years that followed, including the deaths of several of the original mutineers themselves. The settlement that had once focused on construction and survival began experiencing another kind of pressure. The danger no longer came from weather or distance. It existed within the community itself. Population numbers declined. Daily routines continued, but the structure around them had changed. Fields still required work. Animals still required care. Food still had to be gathered and prepared. Ordinary labor did not stop because violence had occurred. But the social environment surrounding that labor became smaller with each loss. The people remaining on the island continued living among locations connected to those who were no longer present. On isolated land, absence becomes visible. There are fewer voices during work. Fewer people walking familiar paths. Fewer places occupied at the end of the day. As the years continued, the settlement on Pitcairn Island became smaller. The original group that had arrived in 1790 no longer existed in its initial form. Violence, illness, and changing conditions had reduced the number of survivors. Some of the people who had crossed the Pacific aboard the Bounty were gone. Others who had arrived with them had also disappeared from the daily life of the island. Historical accounts indicate that by the beginning of the 19th century, only a small number of the original adults remained alive. The settlement adjusted around those losses because there was little alternative. Work continued. Crops still required attention. Animals still moved through the same spaces. Children continued growing into adulthood. Daily life, even after periods of disruption, often returns to practical requirements. The island itself remained largely unchanged. Rain still crossed the ridges. The ocean still moved against the cliffs. Seasons continued without interruption. For those who remained, time had begun to create distance of another kind. The mutiny itself belonged increasingly to memory rather than immediate experience. The ship no longer existed. The journey had ended years earlier. What remained was a community that had gradually become something different from the group that first stepped onto the shore. The settlement had begun as an attempt to disappear. Now it simply continued to exist. Years after HMS Bounty disappeared, ships again reached Pitcairn Island. In 1808, the American sealing vessel Topaz, commanded by Mayhew Folger, arrived near the island and established contact with the settlement. The discovery did not reveal a hidden colony of the size some might have imagined. Instead, visitors found a small community that had continued in isolation for nearly 2 decades. By that time, only one of the original mutineers, John Adams, remained alive among the adult survivors from the first settlement period. The people encountered by visitors represented a community that had developed largely beyond outside observation. There was no dramatic return to the world that had once searched for HMS Bounty. There was only confirmation. The island had remained occupied. And life there had continued. Pitcairn Island remained more than a location connected to a famous mutiny. Its history became a record of what can happen when isolation extends beyond weeks or months and becomes part of ordinary life. The settlement began with escape, uncertainty, and distance. It continued through adaptation, conflict, and survival. The people who arrived there had attempted to move beyond the reach of authority and pursuit. What they found instead was something smaller and more permanent. An island in the Pacific. A place that had once seemed hidden. And for years, a place where the rest of the world simply did not arrive.